The 9th of March, 1974. A jungle clearing on Lubang Island, the Philippines. A man steps out from the tree line. He is 52 years old, but he moves like a soldier half his age. Spine straight, jaw set, eyes scanning the perimeter out of habit. His uniform is patched in dozens of places, repaired so many times with whatever fabric he could find that it barely resembles what it once was. His rifle is clean, his sword is at his hip. He has kept both in working order for 29 years. The world watching him that day expects to see a broken man, a ghost. Someone hollowed out by decades of isolation and fear, stumbling from the jungle, blinking at a civilization that had moved on without him. What they see instead stops them cold. Hiroo Onoda does not look like a man who lost. He looks like a man reporting for duty. The war he had been fighting ended in August 1945. Nobody told him, or rather everyone told him, and he refused to believe any of them. Leaflets dropped from aircraft, letters from his own family, newspapers, photographs, a direct order broadcast over loudspeakers by Japanese generals. He dismissed every single one as enemy propaganda, gathered his remaining men, and kept fighting. For 29 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Hiroo Onoda fought a war that the rest of the world had forgotten. This is not a story about madness. It is not a story about stubbornness. It is a story about what happens when a man is so completely and perfectly built for a single purpose that the purpose outlasts the reason it existed, and the man keeps going anyway. To understand what Onoda became, you need to understand what they made him. In 1942, a 20-year-old Onoda was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was not assigned to a standard infantry unit. He was selected for something rarer and considerably more dangerous, training at the Futamata branch of the Nakano Military School, Japan's primary facility for intelligence officers and guerrilla warfare specialists. The Nakano School was unlike anything else in the Japanese military. Where regular soldiers were trained in discipline and unit cohesion, Nakano students were trained to think independently, survive in isolation, and operate behind enemy lines without support. They studied philosophy, propaganda, history, and covert operations. They were taught languages, codes, and psychological endurance. One instruction above all others separated the Nakano graduates from the rest of the Imperial Army. Regular Japanese soldiers were ordered to die rather than surrender. The shame of capture was considered worse than death. Nakano graduates received the opposite order. They were told to stay alive at all costs, because a dead intelligence officer serves no one. Surrender was still forbidden, but survival was the mission. Onoda later wrote in his memoir that this suited him perfectly. He had found, in those training rooms, exactly the kind of war he was built to fight. In December 1944, he was sent to Lubang Island, a small strategic outpost roughly 150 kilometers southwest of Manila. His orders were direct: conduct guerrilla operations, disrupt Allied supply lines, blow up the airfield and the harbour pier if enemy forces landed, and hold the island. He was told that however long it took, Japanese forces would return for him. It may take 3 years, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, told him on the day he deployed. It may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. 2 months later, American forces landed on Lubang. Most of the Japanese garrison surrendered or died. Onoda took 3 remaining soldiers into the jungle and disappeared. He was 23 years old. He would not emerge for another 29 years. The first leaflet fell from the sky in October 1945. Onoda's group found it on the ground, examined it carefully, and concluded it was Allied propaganda. The war was clearly still ongoing. Why else would the enemy be trying to trick them into giving up? This was the logic that would govern the next 3 decades. Every piece of evidence that the war was over became, in Onoda's framework, further proof that the enemy was desperate enough to manufacture false surrenders. The more elaborate the deception, the more important his mission must be. In 1950, one of his 3 men, Private Yuichi Akatsu, slipped away in the night and surrendered to Philippine forces after 6 months alone. Onoda and the 2 remaining men considered it desertion and betrayal. They became more cautious, more disciplined, more certain that holding firm was the only honourable course. In 1952, letters from their families and photographs were dropped into the jungle. Family faces they had not seen in 7 years, voices in handwritten ink begging them to come home. Onoda studied the letters. He could not find any way to authenticate them. He set them aside. Corporal Shimada was shot and killed in a firefight with Philippine army troops in 1954. Then there were 2. Onoda and Private First Class Kazuka lived in underground caves, moved constantly, raided villages for rice and dried beef, and maintained what they believed was an active guerrilla campaign. They burned rice stores as a signal to Japanese forces that the resistance on Lubang was still alive. Occasionally, they clashed with local police. They killed approximately 30 civilians over the years, genuinely believing each one to be an enemy combatant. In 1959, Onoda and Kazuka were officially declared dead in Japan. Their families had begun the process of grief. The world had filed them away as casualties of a war long over. In the jungle, 2 men continued their patrols. In October 1972, Kazuka was shot and killed by local police during one of their raids. Onoda buried his last comrade and kept moving. He had been alone for over a year when the most unlikely figure in this story walked into the jungle looking for him. Norio Suzuki was 23 years old, a Japanese adventurer who had told friends he was traveling the world in search of 3 things: Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a giant panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He arrived on Lubang in February 1974 with no military escort, no government backing, and no plan beyond camping in jungle clearings and waiting. 4 days later, Onoda called out from the tree line. The 2 men talked for hours. Suzuki told him the war had been over for 29 years. Onoda listened carefully. He did not disbelieve Suzuki exactly, but he was a Nakano graduate. He required official orders. He told Suzuki that he would surrender, but only if his commanding officer came in person and formally relieved him of duty. Most people, hearing this from a man who had spent 3 decades in the jungle, fighting a war that ended before television became common, would have assumed it was the response of someone beyond rational reach. Suzuki did not assume that. He returned to Japan, located Taniguchi, who had become a bookseller, and told him what was needed. Taniguchi flew to Lubang. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. On the 9th of March, 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi stood in a clearing on Lubang Island and read Onoda his formal orders. The 14th Area Army had ceased all combat activity. The Special Squadron was relieved of all military duties immediately. Onoda stood at attention and listened to every word. When Taniguchi finished, he lowered his rifle for the first time in 29 years. He wept. He was the only one in the clearing who did not. He emerged from the jungle in his original uniform, patched and faded, but still worn with precision. He presented his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who formally pardoned him for all actions committed during his time in the jungle. Marcos, whatever his other qualities, understood the theatre of the moment well enough to know that prosecuting a man who had simply followed orders longer than anyone thought possible would serve no useful political purpose. 8,000 people met Onoda at the airport in Tokyo. He was received as a national hero, a living symbol of the virtues Japan had been trying, with mixed success, to either celebrate or bury, depending on which faction of society you consulted. But the return was not what he expected. Japan in 1974 was not the Japan he had left. It was prosperous, westernized, consumed by materialism in ways that genuinely disturbed him. He had stepped out of a jungle and into a country he did not fully recognize. He stayed long enough to write his memoir, which became a bestseller. then bought a cattle ranch in Brazil, and spent the next decade trying to build a life somewhere that felt less like a foreign country than his own homeland had become. He returned to Japan in the 1980s and founded the Onoda Nature School, a wilderness education camp for young Japanese, teaching the survival skills he had spent 3 decades perfecting in a jungle where the survival had served no purpose anyone else could see. He never publicly expressed regret for the 29 years. When asked what had been going through his mind during all that time, he answered with 2 words: "My duty." He died in Tokyo in January 2014 at the age of 91 of pneumonia. He was the second to last Japanese soldier from the Second World War to surrender. The last was Teruo Nakamura, found on a different island 10 months after Onoda, in December 1974. There is a detail about Onoda's story that tends to get lost in the retelling, buried under the more spectacular facts about the length of his vigil and the precision of his uniform. It is this: he was right about almost everything except the one thing that mattered. He was right that the leaflets could be faked. He was right that a determined enemy would go to extraordinary lengths to deceive him. He was right that the letters and photographs could be forgeries. He was right to demand official orders rather than taking a stranger's word for something so consequential as the end of the war he had been sent to fight. Every instinct that kept him in that jungle for 29 years was the product of exactly the training he had received, the training that had been specifically designed to produce exactly this result. A man who trusted nothing, questioned everything, and kept going when everything around him said stop. The Nakano School built the perfect guerrilla. It simply could not unbuild him. Hiroo Onoda stepped from the jungle that March morning in 1974, carrying a clean rifle and a clear conscience. The war had ended 29 years before he put down his sword. In every way that mattered to him, it had not ended one day too soon. He had received his orders. He had followed them. He had waited for the officer who promised to come back for him, and the officer had come. That, to Hiroo Onoda, was not a tragedy. It was a promise kept.